I want to start today by talking about a guilty pleasure that Carrie and I have every year. We look forward to the show MasterChef that comes on in the summer. Are there any other MasterChef fans in here? No. Oh, man, you guys. Oh, what, two? All right, we got two. All right. Yeah, we look so forward to this show, and it's this cooking competition with Gordon Ramsay. He makes it interesting with the British accent. And these home cooks are trying to figure out, who's going to be the best home cook. They go through this competition. And a couple of weeks ago on the episode, it was Apple Week. And so they were cooking things with apples, which I love, and desserts, which I especially love. And there's a guy who is making these apple cupcakes. It was so interesting. He's very excited about these apple cupcakes, going to blow the socks off the judges. And so he's got them, he's making them, he's putting them in the oven, he's looking at them, he's watching them, he's looking at them some more, he's watching them, and he realizes when it's way too late that he forgot a key ingredient in these cupcakes. He forgot the baking powder. So yeah, exactly. The collective. Oh, it was a disaster, right? It was a disaster because he didn't have time to remake it. They're on a timeline, and so he had to think incredibly fast, and he made a decision to rewrite the story. Now, I have never seen this kind of bold move before. Let me tell you about it. Because I've seen people mess up dishes and they get eaten alive by the judges, pun intended on that one. They get eaten alive by the judges. It's like so embarrassing and whatever. And that happens to all of us, right? I mean, if you've ever cooked anything, you've made a disaster before, my guess is you put the wrong ingredient in or forgotten something. So, it happens to all of us. But I've never seen someone pretend that the disaster is intentional. And that's what this guy did. Now, the whole episode's chronicling them making this stuff. So we know what's going on. He's told the judges what he's making, that he's making cupcakes. But he gets up front with his dish, and he explains the dish to the judges, and he says, I made this dish in homage to my grandmother who makes these delicious home cakes. And I made apple home cakes where she didn't use a rising agent in them. And the judges look at him like, seriously, you're not going to do that to us, are you? Right? They said, I thought you were making cupcakes. He's like, no, I was making home cakes all along. There is no ownership, no admission of failure. And I said to Carrie, this guy's an idiot. Who does this, right? And he got destroyed, by the judges, and he got kicked off the island for MasterChef that week. It was a mess, but I got to thinking about this because, he looked so stupid to me, but I got to thinking about how we have a kind of a temptation, all of us, in our parenting, and if you're not a parent in our lives, this is just the reality, that we're all tempted at times to rewrite our story. We're all tempted, we'll stick this up here, we're all tempted to rewrite our story, to normalize what shouldn't be normal. And we do it because we're embarrassed. We do it because we're afraid of how we're going to look. We do it because we don't want the judges to judge us negatively. We do it for our self-esteem. We do it out of fear and anxiety, but I am telling you, better parents don't do that. So we're going to talk about that today in part 3 of our series, Better Parents. We're in part 3, Better Parents. My name's Seth, by the way. I'm one of the pastors here. And we've been talking about parenting, and we've been approaching this conversation with a few assumptions. The first assumption is that most parents want to be good parents. I've never met somebody who's like, I don't care about being a good parent. Everybody wants to be a good parent. In fact, most parents would sacrifice everything they have for their kids. They want their kids to have better opportunities, better experiences, better, you fill in the blank. They want them to have a bright future. So that's kind of our first assumption. And then the other assumption that we've had is that no one taught us how to parent. We teach kids how to drive cars, but we don't really teach people how to be parents. Most of us haven't had a parenting class before. And so we've been approaching this series about the how part. With the how part, how do we be better parents? And so we said the starting point for better parenting is knowing that every parent is an imperfect person raising an imperfect person. Every parent is an imperfect person raising an imperfect person, which is uncomfortable, but it's true. And that's actually the reason why parenting is so hard, because we have to overcome our sinful selves to raise and parent our sinful children. We have to overcome both of those things. We were raised by imperfect, sinful people as well. And so because of that, we talked our first week about how we've been poured into ways of thinking. I described it as molds of thinking that have shaped who we are and have shaped the way that we've looked at the world. Some of those are good. In fact, I hope in your situation, many of those were good. But the truth is, for all of us, some of them weren't. And so the invitation that we said, because of what Jesus has done for us, is to invite him to transform us by renewing our minds, to help us to have better molds, to have different molds. And only Jesus can do that. We talked about that the first week. And then last week, we talked about decisions. We talked about direction in our parenting. We talked about goals in parenting. And I gave you this overarching parenting goal. We said the overarching parenting goal is always relationship. It's always relationship because the days are long, but the years are short. And we blink and they're grown up. We blink and they're teenagers. We blink and they're graduating. We blink and they're getting married. We blink and, just the time goes so fast. And so it's reminding ourselves what's most important ultimately in parenting. I introduced 4 stages of parenting. Here they are. I'm not going to go through all these. I just threw them up there just by way of refresher. If you missed it, you may want to go back and listen to it. In fact, I'd encourage you to just listen to this part. This is gold. And this is not from me. This is from Andy and Sandra Stanley, but it has been so helpful to me in my parenting. I hope it's helpful for you in your parenting, whether you're a parent now, a parent to be, a step parent, or somebody who just has influence in somebody else's life. We all play that role in someone else's life. And so my goal is that this series is helpful regardless of where you are on the parenting spectrum. So that leads us to today, our conversation today. And it's about what's real versus what's ideal. What's real versus what's ideal. Now, I got to give you a heads up. Today could get a little uncomfortable, okay? So for all of us in the room, right, if you're feeling a little uncomfortable, just know that you're not alone. If you're watching online, and you feel a little uncomfortable, don't tune it out, right? Just keep listening because there's a phrase we're all familiar with, no pain, no gain, right? And so it might be a little uncomfortable for us at the beginning, but trust me, there is a redeeming part at the end of this, okay? So stick with me. I just want to give you that as a heads up as we kind of dive into what we're talking about today. Now, the first week of this series, we went back to the very beginning, back to the creation of the world. We went back to when God, created the first human being. His name was Adam, and he said, it's not good for man to be alone, which most of us guys know that. And so he said, I'm going to create a helper for him. And the helper wasn't a bunch of children. It was a wife. It was a spouse. It was a partner for him to help do the work that God had given them to do. Now, that comes from the Old Testament, and throughout that time, God places Adam and Eve in this beautiful, beautiful paradise. He gives them one restriction. He says, just don't eat from this tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but by and large, you are free to do whatever you want, which is a good reminder for us, because I think sometimes we think God's got a no fun policy, but he doesn't, right? He set them in great freedom. They lived in naked bliss. Right? The Garden of Eden is what we might call an ideal paradise. Running around naked, what could be more ideal than that? Just ask my 4-year-old. That is his ideal. In fact, he talked about that last night. Yeah, the rest of us, we don't live there, do we? We're like, not so much. That sounds like a version of hell to us, but that was ideal paradise. But it didn't take long for that paradise to be lost because the crafty serpent, Satan, and we won't go into all the details about Satan, although I will say this, sometimes we like to give Satan godlike characteristics that he does not have. The omni words, like omniscient, Satan doesn't know everything. Omnipresent, Satan isn't always there. Omnipotent, Satan isn't all powerful. We'll do a series on Satan sometime, but just know, he isn't all those, but he is a liar, and he's very crafty. He is a liar and he's crafty, and he said to Eve, did God really say that it's not that big of a deal, right? And so she ate from this apple or the fruit. We don't really know. We tend to think it's an apple, but probably wasn't. And she hands it to her husband, Adam, and gives him some. And she bought the lies, and he bought it too. And suddenly they went from ideal paradise to real brokenness. Like that. And God had set ideal before them, but they traded ideal for something far less. And then fear began driving them. Fear of what God was going to do, fear of what God was going to say, fear of how God was going to respond. Here's what the text in Genesis says, that the eyes of both of them were opened and they realized they were naked. They had no idea before, but now they realized it. So they sewed fig leaves together and they made coverings for themselves. Their nakedness was both literal and it was metaphorical. They had nothing to hide. When we live in ideal paradise, we really have nothing to hide. There is nothing to hide because we have lived what's ideal. It's when we fall from ideal that we have this tendency to cover up because we don't want other people to see how we've fallen short, how we've let them down. We've talked about this before. That's why we take and retake pictures to make sure we get the perfect angle. That's why we don't tell people certain aspects of ourselves, or we dress our best, right, to impress, because we want people to think the best about us. We don't want them to see us naked. So God goes looking for Adam, come out, wherever you are, and Adam's hiding. He's got the OG camo, which is made up of fig leaves. He's got a little Tarzan outfit going on there, and he's hiding, but, God finally finds him, although I think God knew where he was to begin with, and God grills him. He's like, what'd you do? Did you do the thing I told you not to do? And here's his response. The man said, the woman you put here with me. Isn't that great? Let's point our finger. In fact, I'm not just going to point my finger at her. God, I'm going to point my finger at you because I was perfectly fine before you got mixed up into all this, and then you put this woman here, and it created all kinds of problems. She gave me the fruit from the tree, and I ate it. And sin entered the world. And now because of that, we talked about this our first week, that all sin, the Apostle Paul said, all sin and fall short of the glory of God, from his perfection, from the ideal paradise that he created. In fact, when Paul stepped onto the pages of history about 3,000 to 4,000 years after this happened, he was teaching about sin. And look what he said. This is so key. He says, just as sin entered the world through one man. And he's talking about Adam. Now think about this. Just imagine there was a time in history when sin had not entered the world, when there was an ideal paradise, when things were perfect, where no one had to hide. There was no fear of being naked before other people, both physically and metaphorically, because things were perfect. But that came crashing down, and it set in motion a chain of events that resulted, he says, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, because sin kills things. That's the nature of sin. It always kills things. We're going to come back to that here in a little bit. But continuing on, he says, and in this way, death came to all people because all sinned. Paul says it's easy to point a finger at Adam, and that's maybe where the original sin, there's a doctrine of original sin that we, church people talk about sometimes. That's where this all comes from, through Adam. But the reality is, when you point a finger at somebody else, there are 3 fingers pointing back at yourself. And you can spend a lot of time pointing your fingers at what Adam did, but the truth is he laid the groundwork for all people till kingdom come. And if we had been the ones who were there, we probably would have done the exact same thing. And that, my friends, it's just very real. It's very real. That's the world that we live in. It's the world that we all face, especially in our culture today. And because of that, there's a temptation that we wrestle with. It's the temptation to abandon ideal so we can normalize real. Because that's what we've known, that's what we've experienced. And so we just think, well, ideal is not even possible anymore. So we'll just normalize real and pretend and rewrite the story and pretend that this is the way it should be. The reason we do that is because ideal is no longer possible. It is no longer possible because of Adam in the garden, although, again, we would have probably done the same thing. And it's not fair, but life isn't fair, right? That went out in the Garden of Eden. We would have messed it up too. Ideal is no longer possible, so we act like real isn't a big deal. I apologize in advance for all the rhyming because there will be a lot of it here. But we don't want to feel bad, right? So we act like our real isn't a big deal. We don't want kids to feel bad, so we act like our real isn't a big deal, or their families, their real isn't a big deal. We don't want other people to feel bad, so we want to include everybody. We're very inclusive on television. We have inclusive characters for everything. In our books, we want to normalize everything and pretend that it's all very normal. In our language, in our activities, we want to make sure everybody's invited, everybody has a seat at the table. And before we point our fingers at that, you should just know I actually think that has a piece of the thumbprint of Jesus on it. Because if Jesus were to host a party, do you know who he would have invited? Well, actually, we do know who he invited. He invited very real people. He set a bigger table. Everybody was always included. There's an account where Jesus was leaving his hometown of Nazareth, and he hadn't figured out who all of his disciples were yet, or he hadn't called them all to follow him. He had several. Peter was there and some others. And so they pass a tax collector whose name is Levi or Matthew, depending on which version you read. And so Matthew, he was hated by the Jewish people, even though he was Jewish, because he's collecting taxes on behalf of Rome. So he's like working for the enemy, right? And he was the type of person that Jesus was coming to like save the Israelites against. He was coming to rescue them from people like Matthew. And so you can only imagine how confusing it was for Peter and the others when Jesus called Matthew to become one of his disciples. And then he's like, hey, let's go over to Matthew's house and hang out. And Peter and the others are probably thinking, well, I don't want the cooties from Matthew's house, right? This is not ideal. This is not ideal. I don't want anything to do with this. And yet what's really cool is we actually have a recording from Matthew about this encounter when Jesus was over at his house hanging out with all these less than ideal people. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners, like their tax collectors are lower than sinners. If there's a scale, the tax collectors are at the bottom rung. Many tax collectors and sinners came and they ate with him and his disciples. Nobody was excluded. Jesus built this bigger table and invited all people to participate. And then the religious leaders found out, and they weren't very happy. The text goes on, it says, when the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners? Like, God has standards. Doesn't Jesus know that? Isn't he aware that these people are less than ideal? Surely he doesn't want to be around these very real people. Now, we have reason to believe that this probably took place at the party. So whether they were inside the house or outside the house, we don't exactly know, but we do know that Jesus overheard it and he came to rescue his disciples. Maybe he wasn't sure how they were going to respond. So he's like, let me just go ahead and answer that for you. And he answered it for them, for the Pharisees, the religious leaders, for the people who were there at the party, for us 2,000 years later. But I just want you to think about what he says here because it's almost offensive. Here's what he says. He says, it's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. Now just imagine you're a tax collector there at the party. You see one of the hosts, go out and leave, and you're like, well, did he just call me sick? I mean, did he just say that what I'm doing is wrong? Did he just call me? I mean, he just said sick. He can't be talking about me. But Jesus says, but go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners. What? How could Jesus call them sinners? I mean, all those are Matthew's friends. How could he possibly call them sinners? See, it's tempting to believe that Jesus didn't care about what's ideal because of who he surrounded himself with. And interestingly enough, people who were unlike Jesus loved being around Jesus. Like they loved Jesus, and he seemed to like them back. He was never concerned about what people would think. He was comfortable living with a tension that so often we avoid. It's the tension of grace and truth. Grace and truth, which is really a fancy way of saying real and ideal. And depending on your family of origin, my guess is your family lived in one of those. You were either a grace family where anything went, you do you, que sera, sera, whatever will be, and you just kind of like lived your own life and there were no rules and everybody hung out and it was seemingly great. Or you lived in the truth family where it was like, no, there's a law and you're going to obey it, and if you don't obey it, there are going to be some massive consequences for you. All the kids who lived in the truth families wish they could move to somebody in the grace families, but what they didn't know, it's true, right? But what they didn't know is that the kids in the grace families actually wish they had a piece of the truth family in their families, because it's hard to know if you're loved if there are no rules and regulations and you don't know where you stand with anybody ever. Which is maybe one of the reasons why our culture is falling apart and there is seemingly no happiness in our culture, because we've thrown out ideal. We've landed in grace. And so our temptation is to throw out ideal because it feels so unreal. And that's the temptation that we all have, whether you're a parent or not. Because ideal isn't how we've lived. It's not necessarily how we were raised. It's not how we were treated. It's not how you spent your sorority years or your fraternity years. It's not how you lived out your first marriage or maybe your second marriage. Ideal isn't how we spend our free time. And so the temptation is to settle for real and forget about ideal. And that carries over into our parenting. I mentioned in the first week of our series that in the Old Testament, there aren't a lot of great parenting highlights. There are some parenting disasters. There are a few good sort of things, but in the New Testament, we have a lot of good teaching on parenting and how to, follow Jesus, but there aren't really any examples. What's interesting to me is that the New Testament was written to a group of people who were so far away from the ideal that Jesus and his first century followers set forth. I mean, you think about it. It was a Greco-Roman culture. So many of the people who became followers of Jesus weren't Jewish. They didn't have any context of Jewish teaching. And so what was presented to them must have sounded not only ridiculous, but completely impossible. Like, that's nice. Why don't you go, ride your unicorn over the rainbow, right? I mean, that's just so far out there. Things like women having equal status with men. That's something that we take for granted in our Christianized culture. That did not exist 2,000 years ago in the Roman world. The idea that we wouldn't have selective abortion because, certain genders were considered more valuable than other genders. That was just normal 2,000 years ago. The idea that kids were owned by their parents and kind of like slaves, mini slaves for their parents, that was normal 2,000 years ago. So when the New Testament authors and leaders and early church leaders came in and began teaching these different things, it sounded so pie in the skyish. It sounded so ridiculous. New Testament teachings like this from Ephesians, this is from Paul. He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And then he says, honor your father and your mother. Why do I have to honor my mother? The father's the most important one in the family. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with a promise. Obey your parents because God put them there to help you learn authority. He placed them in an authority in your life, and when you learn to submit to authority, you'll understand that God is ultimately the main authority, and when you submit to the people under you, your life will ultimately be better, and you'll learn how God operates. Do this, and you'll be blessed. Then he goes on, this is just to the dads, check this out. He says, fathers, now it's interesting, he doesn't say fathers and mothers, but you'll see why. He says, fathers, do not exasperate your children. That's generally a temptation for the dads, isn't it? Right? To exasperate and frustrate, which is kind of like to drive a wedge, to provoke, to move them in the direction of resentment. Like dads, don't tease your kids to the point where they don't even want to talk to you anymore. Dads, don't ride your kids so hard that they want to leave the house when they're done, right? But instead, he says, bring them up in the training and in the instruction of the Lord. Your responsibility, dads, is to pass faith on to your children, because they are equal with you before God. Your faith matters. It needs to be presented and passed on to them. In Colossians, the Apostle Paul said this. He said, wives, submit yourselves to your husbands as is fitting to the Lord, not because he deserves it, but because God submitted himself to you when he sent Jesus to die on the cross for you, because Jesus gave his life to you. Now, these were not shocking to a first century audience the way they kind of are shocking to us and they make us uncomfortable. What came next is what was shocking to the first century audience, because Paul didn't end there. He added this. He says, husbands, love your wives and do not be harsh with them, because they're not your possession. You don't own your wife. Treat her with equal value. Love her. Sacrifice for her. Do everything you can for her. Watch your words. Make sure that you're being gracious and kind and that you're reflecting Jesus and the way that he showed kindness and love to you. Kindness and love were not values in the Roman world. That came through Christianity. This was so out there. This was so unrelatable. This was so ideal. And it wasn't just Paul, it was Peter too. In 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter says, husbands, in the same way, and he had just talked about wives live such godly lives that it's inspirational to your husbands. So he says, husbands, in the same way, continuing on, be considerate as you live with your wives and treat them with respect as the weaker partner and as heirs with you. Like they have the same faith you have. They are equal in God's sight, with heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. They are equal in God's sight. I know they've not been equal in your sight, Romans, but they're equal in God's sight. Again, so out there. I mean, the Christian teaching. that husbands would love their wives, that wives would submit to their husbands, that kids would honor their fathers and mothers, that dads wouldn't exasperate their children. It sounds so ideal, so old-fashioned. But don't miss this. Jesus never gave permission to sacrifice ideal because it was too unreal, because it was too unlikely, because it was too out there. Instead, do you know what he did? He offered grace. He offered grace. One of the best examples of this, maybe the most extreme examples, is incredibly uncomfortable. It came in a situation where the religious leaders were trying to trap Jesus. He had taught on divorce before, and his teaching on divorce didn't really match up with what they had believed about divorce. And so he thought, well, the religious leaders thought, well, this is a way that we can trap him and we can pit Jesus against Moses, because the Jewish people thought the law came through Moses, and so Moses is like the guy, and if we can, get Jesus opposed to Moses, then people stop following Jesus, and this will ruin his ministry. And so they see this kind of chink in his armor maybe, and they try to exploit it, and so they confront him and they ask him about divorce. Here's what went down. Matthew recorded it. It says, some Pharisees, the religious leaders, they came to him to test him. And so they asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Now, they had a version in their law of like no-fault divorce when the guy can be like, hey, you burned my bread today. You're gone. You're out of here. We're done. This marriage is over. And it was slanted toward the men. I mean, it just was slanted toward the men. He could divorce her for no reason, whatever. And it was almost like the law supported it. And so Jesus responded, and here's what he said. He said, haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning, ideal paradise, at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female. And he said, continuing on, for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Now, just imagine like two sheets of paper being glued together. You can't tear those apart, right? You cannot unone what becomes one flesh. It's just impossible to do. That's what Jesus was referring to. He said they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So what was starting out as seemingly a trap for Jesus suddenly turned on them, and they're like, wait a minute, it almost sounds like Jesus is saying that we shouldn't divorce at all. Jesus, is that what you're saying? Because that's going against what Moses said too. So they respond back. They say this. They say, why then, continuing on, why then did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Like, we can play this game, Jesus. Why did Moses do that? Now, to be clear, Moses didn't actually command people to be divorced. Divorce was happening. Moses put some boundaries around it. They thought they're doing this mic drop on Jesus, but no such luck. It didn't faze him. He replied to them, continuing on, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. That's real. But it was not this way. What's this say? From the beginning. Ideal. Back in ideal paradise, two became one. That was lost. And so our response sometimes to that is, well, that's not possible anymore, Jesus. And I think his response back to us is, I know. That's why I'm here. So Jesus, do you hate divorce? Yes. So what are you going to do to divorce people? I'm going to give my life for them. I'm going to sacrifice myself for them to restore them because they're living in something that's less than ideal. The grace part, yeah, it's real. But I'm going to give my life for you. Divorce is a big deal. Don't be flippant about it, he says. Paul, who kind of recognized the damage of Adam, he saw the restoration of Jesus. And here's what he said. He said, for just as through the disobedience of the one man, he's talking about Adam, the many were made sinners, that's all. So also, though, through the obedience of the one man, the many will be made righteous. Which is why Jesus was able to walk on the earth and say, I hate the sin, but I love the sinner. I hate divorce because it wreaks havoc on family, it wreaks havoc on children, it wreaks havoc on you. But it wasn't just divorce. You need to understand that. That was one example that Jesus used. I mean, there was a situation of adultery. He talks about adultery and basically made all the men out to be adulterers. I mean, he just raised the bar. He's like, hey, if you've ever looked at lust with a woman in your heart, you've committed adultery because you know it's damaging to her. You're just using her as an object of your pleasure, and it's damaging to your marriage if you're married because she's not your wife, right? So, I mean, he raised the bar, and then he says, don't do it. I'm going to die for you because I know you're going to do it. I love you anyway. Don't go stop sinning. I love you. He did the same thing with hatred and murder. He says, look, if you ever looked at another person with hatred in your heart, you basically murdered that other person. You're a murderer, whether you want to recognize it or not. But you know what? I'm going to give my life for you because I love you. Grace for Jesus was never an excuse to ignore ideal. It was never a reason to let go of ideal. In fact, here's what the Apostle Paul said in response to this later in Romans. He says, we are those, continuing on, Romans chapter 6. What shall we say then? Shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. By no means. Should we forget about ideal because we've lived real? No. Should we forget about ideal because we know it's impossible? No. That's what grace is for. But grace is so wonderful and great. Shouldn't we eat up as much of it as we can? Jesus, isn't that what we should do? Paul says, no. Do you know why? Here's what he says. He says, we are those who have died to sin. How can we live in it any longer? It was killing us. It was killing us. Why would we want to go back to it when we know God has something better for us? The ideal is that God empowers us with his Holy Spirit to live differently in the future. Now, I get it. These teachings, they're not normal. Right? They're not normal. In fact, I can see some of your eyes, and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you said that. These are not normal teachings. I get it, right? They weren't normal 2,000 years ago either, though, and that's the point. We're all invited to live into ideal, even if ideal isn't what we have lived so far. And in parenting, right, it's not easy to point our kids to ideal in our culture because as our culture wanders away from ideal, it's not the example we have for them. And quite honestly, it's not easy because we have not lived ideal either. We've sinned. We've divorced. We've committed adultery. We've looked at pornography. We've pointed our fingers at other people. We've lied. We've had hatred in our hearts. We have provoked our kids. We have disrespected our husbands. We have failed to love our wives. But isn't it true that we want our kids to experience better than our real? I mean, isn't that what we want for our kids? Every divorced adult wants something better for their kids. Every parent of a girl wants their daughter to grow up and marry a man who is not going to abandon her when he finds somebody better later on. Every parent of a daughter wants his daughter to grow up or her daughter to grow up and marry a guy who's not going to trade intimacy with her for images on a device. Every parent of boys wants their sons to grow up and marry a woman who will not speak in a demeaning, degrading way, telling them such a moron, you'll never amount to anything, and just criticize and cut down. Every parent wants their sons to not just grow up believing boys will be boys when we know that our own, immorality and whatever decisions have brought scars in our lives. Every parent of daughters should want their daughters not to grow up dressing in a way that says open for business when we know that our own immorality has not been a good thing, our own impurity has not been a good thing. Why would we settle for less than ideal? Why would we point our children toward less than ideal? Why would we teach our kids to hate other people and be unkind and be judgmental? If you have an addiction, you do not want your kids growing up with an addiction. We want something better. Let's not rewrite the story to justify the real that we have lived and throw out the ideal that Jesus set forward. He never gave us permission to do that. He said, I hate your sin, but I love you. I didn't come for the healthy. I came for the sick. I came to call sinners to repentance, to move in a different direction. I forgive you. Leave your life of sin. I'll show you grace. But you need truth. Why would we encourage our kids down any different path? Down a path that caused us pain personally. Don't miss this. The real that every one of us has lived is that sin kills things. It's killed relationships. It's killed marriages. It has killed self-esteem. It's killed our self-images. It's killed our finances. It's killed job opportunities. It's killed all sorts of things in our lives. Why wouldn't we tell our kids that if we're not actively killing sin, it will kill us? That's why God gave his Holy Spirit, to indwell in us, to convict us of sin, to point us in a different direction, to empower us to say no, to move in the direction that he's called us to. Listen, in parenting, we live with the tension of real versus ideal, and better parents never abandon ideal because it just seems too unreal. And better parents never pretend that how they've lived is the right way to live. Last week, we talked about having generational wisdom that we pass on to our children. And one of those ways is just being honest with our kids about how we have fallen short in an age-appropriate conversation, and in an age-appropriate context. It's not a, hey, let me just tell you all my dirty laundry, but it's being honest and saying, look, I made this mistake, I did this sin, and it cost me this, and it was the wrong thing, and I hope you don't ever choose that path. God's grace is so big, and I am so thankful for that. And he has forgiven me and restored me. But I hope you don't have to go through what I went through. I'm telling you, there have been conversations I've had with my own kids about things that it's like, this was the wrong thing, and I have lived the wrong way, and there is a better way, and God is calling us into that, and he's calling you into that. And we have the opportunity to encourage our children to live differently. And that is such a powerful teaching moment for our kids, where we don't gloss over the lives we've lived, but we point them toward the ideal that Jesus set out. So I have one question I want to just leave us with as we close. And it's, in what ways do you hope your kids live a better life than you? In what ways do you hope your kids live a better life than you? If you don't have kids, you can still think about this question. If you had them, in what ways do you wish it were different? Let's start living in that direction. Let's point our children in that direction. Let's have grace in the process, because we're all going to fall short. But let's not give up pointing the direction we need to point in and leaning into the person of Jesus. Better parents, I'm just telling you, better parents live in the tension of grace and truth. Jesus came in the embodiment of grace and truth. He never abandoned one at the expense of the other. It was all grace, all truth, all the time. And better parents understand that as they raise their kids. Now, in order to do that, it requires some humility, and it requires love. And so we're going to talk about humility and love next week as we bring this series to a close. I promise it will be a little lighter than today, and I think you're going to appreciate it. I hope you'll be back, but I hope you'll think about that. In what ways do you wish your kids would live a better life than you? Let me pray for us. Heavenly Father, I know this is heavy, but the beautiful thing, the gospel, is that there's grace, that you have met all of us with grace. And unfortunately, we all know real brokenness. We all do. We've all lived real brokenness. We've lost the ideal paradise, but help us not to settle for less. Help us not to forget moving in the direction of ideal, even though we've lived in what's real. God, thank you for your goodness. Thank you for your grace that meets every one of us where we are. I pray for the person who maybe is just kind of wrestling with that. I pray that you would give us the courage to lead our families in a different direction, even than what we've lived, and to point them in the direction of you. God, give each one of us wisdom to know what we need to do in response to what we've heard. Give us courage to do it, and meet us in this place with your incredible grace and your truth. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.